Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. The entryway didn't catch my shoulder this morning. The familiar scrape against my coat as I brushed past was missing, replaced by a sleek glide that caught me off guard. Each step along the hallway should have echoed a comforting thud beneath my feet, but the sound never came. Instead, I walked on, guided by muted vibrations that felt distant and detached. The mirror in the hallway seemed to hold its reflection a breath too long, as if unsure whether to release it back to the world. I paused, my hand hovering near the surface it should have felt cool, but instead it lingered on an unspoken warmth. The warmth, that's what keeps coming back to me, not the kind you'd expect from sunlight streaming through windows or heat rising from vents, something else. Something that made my skin crawl even as it comforted me. I've been trying to piece together when things started feeling wrong. The house had always been the same house. Same walls, same corners where shadows gathered in predictable patterns, but somewhere along the way it began to breathe differently. The air moved in ways I couldn't track. There was a conversation. I remember fragments of it, voices that seemed to come from rooms I hadn't entered. Someone was explaining something to me, their tone patient but strained. The words felt important, urgent even, but they slipped away before I could grasp them fully. "You need to understand," the voice said, or maybe it was, "you need to remember." The distinction matters now, though I couldn't tell you why. I found myself standing in the kitchen more often than usual, not cooking, not eating, just standing. The refrigerator hummed a tune I didn't recognize, and the faucet dripped in a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate. One drop, pause, two drops, pause, one drop again. The pattern meant something, I was sure of it. My reflection in the hallway mirror looked tired, more tired than I felt, which was saying something. There were shadows under my eyes that seemed deeper than they should be, and my mouth held a tension I didn't remember putting there. When I smiled to test it, the expression felt foreign, like borrowing someone else's face. The house was quieter now, or maybe I was hearing it differently. Sounds that used to blend into background noise now stood out with sharp clarity. The settling of wood, the whisper of air through gaps I couldn't see, footsteps that might have been mine, echoing from rooms I wasn't in. I started keeping notes, small things, observations that seemed worth recording. The way certain floorboards felt softer underfoot, how the light from the windows cast shadows that didn't match the objects creating them. The smell of something sweet and cloying that appeared in random corners, then vanished when I tried to identify it. But the notes disappeared, not all at once. One by one, pages went missing from the notebook I kept by my bed. At first I thought I'd misplaced them. Then I wondered if I'd never written them at all. Memory is a strange thing. You trust it completely until you have reason not to, and then you question everything. Did that conversation really happen? Was there actually someone else in the house, or was I talking to myself? The voice had been so clear, so insistent. "It's not your fault," they'd said, or maybe I'd said it to them. The mirror in the hallway became a checkpoint of sorts. Each time I passed, I'd pause and study my reflection, looking for changes. Sometimes my face seemed thinner. Other times my eyes appeared darker. Once I could have sworn I saw someone standing behind me, but when I turned, the hallway stretched empty in both directions. The warmth was strongest near the mirror. It radiated from the glass itself, as if the surface held heat from some unseen source. I pressed my palm against it once, expecting the usual cool shock of glass, but instead felt something that pulsed gently against my skin. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the house settle around me, but the sounds seemed too purposeful to be random. Creaks followed patterns. Whispers carried the cadence of conversation. Sometimes I heard my own voice responding to questions I couldn't remember being asked. The kitchen visits increased. I'd find myself there without recalling the decision to go, standing by the counter or staring into the sink. The faucet's dripping had evolved into something more complex. One drop, pause, two drops, three drops, pause, one drop. The sequence repeated with mechanical precision. I tried turning the faucet tighter, but the dripping continued. I tried ignoring it, but the sound seemed to follow me into other rooms. Eventually, I realized I was counting along with it, my lips moving silently as each drop fell. There were phone calls, at least I think there were. The phone would ring and I'd answer, but the conversations felt like listening to one side of a dialogue between strangers. Someone asking questions I couldn't quite understand. Someone providing answers that didn't match what I thought I'd said. "Are you sure?" they'd ask. "I think so," I'd hear myself reply, though I wasn't sure what I was agreeing to. The calls always ended the same way, with a gentle click that left me holding a dead receiver and wondering if I'd imagined the entire exchange. My reflection began arriving at the mirror before I did, not by much, just a fraction of a moment, but enough to notice. I'd round the corner into the hallway and catch a glimpse of myself already there, waiting. When I stopped walking, the reflection would continue for just a beat longer before matching my stillness. The notebook reappeared one morning, sitting on the kitchen counter where I definitely hadn't left it. The pages I thought were missing were all there, but the handwriting looked different, shakier, more urgent. Words were underlined multiple times, and some sentences trailed off mid-thought. "The warmth isn't coming from outside," one entry read. "It's coming from inside, from me. But that doesn't make sense because I'm cold, always cold now." I didn't remember writing that. Another page contained a single word repeated dozens of times: remember. The letters grew more frantic with each repetition, until the final few were barely legible scratches across the paper. The house began to feel smaller. Rooms that had always seemed spacious now pressed closer, their walls somehow nearer than before. I'd reach for familiar objects and find them inches away from where they should be. Light switches appeared in different positions. Doorways seemed narrower. But when I measured, everything was exactly as it had always been. The voice returned, clearer now, not from another room this time, but right beside me as I stood in the hallway. I could feel breath against my ear, warm and steady. "You're starting to remember," it whispered. I turned, but found only empty space, and the mirror reflecting my startled face back at me. The dripping from the kitchen faucet had become a symphony. One drop, pause, two drops, three drops, four drops, pause. The pattern was expanding, growing more complex with each cycle. I started timing it, counting seconds between sequences, but the rhythm shifted whenever I tried to predict it. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams that felt more like memories. Conversations with people whose faces I couldn't see. Decisions being made about things I couldn't name. A sense of urgency that followed me into waking, leaving me breathless and confused. In one dream, I was explaining something important to someone who wouldn't listen. My voice grew more desperate as I tried to make them understand, but the words kept changing even as I spoke them. By the end, I wasn't sure what I'd been trying to say. The mirror in the hallway cracked, a hairline fracture that ran vertically down the center, splitting my reflection into two slightly misaligned halves. The crack hadn't been there the night before. I was certain of that, but when I ran my finger along the glass, I felt no break in the surface. The crack was on the inside somehow. My reflection began to lag more noticeably. I'd raise my hand and it would follow a moment later. I'd turn my head and the reflection would complete the motion just after I'd stopped moving. The delay was subtle but constant, as if I were watching myself through water. The notebook entries became more erratic, pages filled with observations that contradicted each other. Times when I claimed to be alone alternated with detailed descriptions of conversations, maps of the house that showed rooms in impossible configurations, lists of sounds that couldn't exist. The warmth is getting stronger, one entry read. It's not comfortable anymore, it's urgent, like a fever that won't break, like something trying to push its way out. The handwriting on that page looked nothing like mine. I started avoiding the hallway, taking longer routes through the house to bypass the mirror. But the warmth followed me anyway, radiating from surfaces I'd touched, lingering in spaces I'd occupied. It was becoming part of me, or maybe I was becoming part of it. The voice spoke more frequently now, offering commentary on my daily routines. It knew things I didn't remember telling it, details about my habits, my fears, my thoughts. Sometimes it finished sentences I'd started in my head. "You're almost ready," it said one morning as I stood in the kitchen, listening to the increasingly complex rhythm of the dripping faucet. "Ready for what?" I asked aloud, surprising myself. But there was no answer, just the sound of water hitting the sink in patterns I could no longer decode. The house felt like it was waiting. Every room held a tension that made my skin crawl. Shadows lingered longer than they should. Sounds echoed from empty spaces. The air itself seemed thick with anticipation. I found myself back at the mirror despite my efforts to avoid it. The crack had spread, creating a web of fractures that divided my reflection into fragments. Each piece showed a slightly different angle, a different expression. It was like looking at myself through the eyes of multiple observers. The warmth pulsed stronger near the mirror, matching a rhythm I recognized but couldn't place. One pulse, pause, two pulses, three pulses. It was the same pattern as the dripping faucet, the same sequence that had been building in complexity. My reflection moved independently now, no longer following my actions but performing its own. It turned to face me directly while I stood in profile. It smiled while my face remained neutral. It pressed its palm against the glass from the other side, and I felt the warmth intensify. "Do you remember now?" the voice asked, and this time I realized it was coming from the reflection. The notebook was filled with entries I definitely hadn't written. Pages and pages of observations in handwriting that grew more familiar as I read. It was my handwriting, but from someone who knew things I didn't. Someone who had been watching, taking notes, preparing. "The transition is almost complete," the final entry read. "Soon there won't be a difference between inside and outside, between reflection and reality. The warmth will be everywhere, and I'll finally be home." I looked up from the notebook to find myself standing in the hallway again, though I didn't remember walking there. The mirror showed my reflection clearly now, all cracks healed, the surface smooth and perfect. But the reflection was smiling, and I wasn't. The warmth surrounded me completely, no longer coming from any particular source, but radiating from everywhere at once. From the walls, from the floor, from my own skin. It was the warmth of recognition, of something long awaited finally arriving. The entryway scraped against my shoulder as I passed through it, the familiar resistance returning. But now I understood it wasn't the house that had changed. It was me who had been different all along. The mirror in the hallway holds its reflection a breath too long, as if unsure whether to release it back to the world. But now I know it's not uncertainty. It's Patient's story, too. It wasn't unusual for the lights to flicker. Sometimes the power would dip just enough to make the room feel momentarily alive with shadows. I usually kept my eyes on the television, convinced the show would reveal everything I needed to know. The afternoons passed quietly, the mail piled up on the kitchen table, unopened. The dust on the windowsills seemed thicker each day, though no one ever commented on it. I noticed a strange pattern in the flowers beside the porch, petals drooping as if they felt the weight of something unseen. By dusk, I made sure the front gate remained unlatched. The television remote had worn smooth under my thumb. The plastic had taken on an oily sheen from countless hours of channel surfing, searching for answers that never came. Each button press felt deliberate, methodical. The local news always started at the same time, and I always watched with the same expectation. The anchor's voice had become as familiar as my own breathing, her inflection predictable when she discussed missing persons cases. I memorized the way her eyebrows lifted slightly when she mentioned details the police hadn't released to the public. That coffee mug on the side table held cold dregs that had formed a thin film across the surface. The ceramic bore a hairline crack that hadn't been there before, running from the handle down to the base like a deliberate mark. I couldn't remember dropping it, couldn't recall any moment of impact, yet there it was. The crack seemed to widen each time I looked, though that might have been my imagination. The mug had belonged to someone else once, someone who preferred their coffee black and strong, someone who left rings on wooden surfaces without thinking to use coasters. The photographs on the mantelpiece faced different directions now. I hadn't moved them, hadn't dusted around them, yet their angles had shifted over the weeks. Some faced the wall, others tilted toward the window as if trying to catch better light. In one frame, a face I recognized but couldn't quite place smiled back at me, frozen in a moment I couldn't recall witnessing. The glass reflected the flickering television screen, creating double images that made it difficult to distinguish between the photograph and the reflection. Those curtains had always been heavy, but lately they seemed to move without any breeze. The fabric was thick enough to block most of the afternoon sun, yet shadows still found ways to creep across the floor in patterns that defied logic. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, a subtle sway that stopped the moment I turned to look directly. The curtain rods showed signs of frequent adjustment, small scratches in the metal where someone had repeatedly moved the rings back and forth. The kitchen table bore the weight of more than just unopened mail. Beneath the stack of envelopes, I could see the outline of something else, something that had been there longer than the letters. The wood showed indentations, circular marks that suggested a heavy object had rested there for extended periods. When I moved the mail aside, the marks revealed themselves as perfect rings, too precise to be accidental, too deliberate to be forgotten. The grain of the wood seemed darker within those circles, as if stained by something that had since been removed. My reflection in the hallway mirror appeared different each time I passed. Sometimes my face looked thinner, more angular, with shadows under my eyes that hadn't been there in the morning. Other times I seemed younger, more uncertain, wearing expressions I didn't remember making. The mirror itself was old, its silver backing spotted with age, creating gaps in the reflection that made my image appear incomplete. I began avoiding direct eye contact with my own reflection, focusing instead on the wall behind me, which showed things I couldn't see when I turned around. The floorboards in the bedroom creaked in a specific sequence. 3 short groans followed by a longer, deeper sound, as if someone were walking the same path repeatedly. The pattern occurred at irregular intervals, sometimes during the day, sometimes in the deep hours of night. I'd learned to anticipate the sounds, counting the seconds between each creak, mapping the invisible footsteps across the floor above. Yet when I climbed the stairs to investigate, the boards remained silent under my own weight. That smell in the basement grew stronger each time I descended the stairs. It wasn't unpleasant exactly, more like old paper mixed with something metallic, something that reminded me of pennies left in a pocket too long. The scent seemed to emanate from the far corner, where boxes stacked against the wall contained items I couldn't remember storing. The cardboard had begun to sag, suggesting the contents were heavier than they appeared, or perhaps moisture had found its way into places it shouldn't have been. The telephone rang at precise intervals, but no one ever spoke when I answered. The silence on the other end felt occupied, as if someone were listening carefully to my breathing, measuring the duration of my responses. I began counting the rings before picking up, noting that the pattern never varied. 7 rings, always 7, then silence when I lifted the receiver. The dial tone that followed seemed louder than it should have been, almost accusatory in its mechanical persistence. Those shoes by the front door weren't mine. I'd noticed them gradually, first assuming they belonged to a visitor who'd forgotten them, then realizing no visitors had come for weeks. The leather was worn in patterns that suggested a different gait, a different way of walking, someone who favored their left foot or perhaps carried extra weight on one side. The laces were tied in a style I didn't recognize, loops that seemed more complex than necessary, more deliberate than casual. The garden outside had begun to reorganize itself. Plants I'd never watered continued to thrive, while others I tended carefully withered without explanation. The soil showed signs of recent disturbance in areas I hadn't touched, small mounds that appeared overnight, depressions that filled with rainwater and reflected the sky like tiny mirrors. The pattern of growth seemed intentional, as if someone were cultivating specific areas while deliberately neglecting others. My journal entries had gaps I couldn't account for. Pages that should have contained my thoughts from recent days remained blank, while others held handwriting that resembled mine but felt foreign somehow. The ink was different, darker, and the pressure of the pen had been heavier, leaving impressions that showed through multiple pages. Some entries described events I couldn't remember experiencing, conversations with people whose names I'd apparently decided not to record. The clock in the kitchen had begun running slow, losing exactly 7 minutes each day. I'd noticed the pattern gradually, first thinking I'd misread the time, then realizing the delay was consistent, predictable. The second hand moved in tiny jerks rather than smooth sweeps, as if struggling against some invisible resistance. When I wound it manually, the mechanism felt different, grittier, as if small particles had worked their way into the gears. Those letters in the mailbox weren't addressed to me, yet they continued to arrive. The name on the envelopes was similar enough to mine that a postal worker might have made an honest mistake, but the similarity felt too precise to be coincidental. I'd stopped opening them after the first few, which contained information that seemed to reference my life but from a perspective I didn't recognize, details that were accurate but somehow wrong. The water pressure in the upstairs bathroom had changed, becoming stronger at night and weaker during the day, as if someone else were using the system when I couldn't observe them. The pipes made different sounds now, not the familiar groans of old plumbing but newer noises, sharper and more metallic. The mirror above the sink had developed a crack that spread in a pattern too organic to be random, like branches or veins mapping some invisible circulation. My memory of recent conversations had begun to blur with television dialogue. I'd find myself recalling discussions that felt real but matched scenes I'd watched on various shows. The distinction between what I'd actually said and what I'd heard actors say became increasingly difficult to maintain. Sometimes I'd catch myself responding to questions no one had asked or finishing sentences that had only been spoken on screen. The front gate latch had been oiled recently, though I couldn't remember doing it myself. The metal moved silently now, without the familiar squeak that had announced visitors for years. The hinges showed fresh lubrication, and the mechanism operated with a smoothness that felt deliberate, purposeful. Someone had wanted the gate to open and close without sound, without the warning I'd grown accustomed to relying on. Those footprints in the soft earth beside the porch appeared after rain, but didn't match any shoes I owned. The tread pattern was distinctive, with a worn spot on the left heel that created an asymmetrical impression. The prints led from the gate to the front door, then disappeared on the harder ground, as if whoever made them had learned to walk more carefully on surfaces that wouldn't record their passage. The house key had developed scratches around the lock mechanism, tiny marks that suggested frequent use by someone unfamiliar with the proper angle of insertion. The brass showed where patterns different from my own habits, and sometimes the key turned more easily than it should have, as if the lock had been recently practiced upon. I'd begun to wonder if copies existed, if other hands had held this same piece of metal and learned its particular requirements. That photograph I'd been staring at on the mantelpiece finally came into focus. The face belonged to someone I'd known well, someone whose absence I'd been trying not to acknowledge. But the more I studied the image, the more I realized it wasn't a photograph at all, but a reflection in the glass, a face that appeared only when the light hit the frame at precisely the right angle. The person looking back at me wore an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of sadness and something that might have been warning. Story 3. I assured them nothing had been moved, claimed each item rested exactly where it belonged, untouched and undisturbed. The officers seemed satisfied, their pens scratching on paper as they recorded my words. Yet the air inside felt different, cool and metallic, like a room that had been hastily rearranged. A faint crease marred the carpet's once smooth surface, hinting at something unseen. My skin prickled with the memory of something brushed past, an almost invisible touch. The room's familiar scent was edged with a sharpness that defied my claim. The walls stood silent, but they knew otherwise. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting familiar shadows across my living room. I remember how the sun hit the coffee table at exactly the right angle, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Everything appeared normal when I walked through the front door after my evening shift. The television remote sat in its usual spot on the armrest. The stack of magazines remained precisely aligned on the side table. Even the throw pillow held the same indentation from where I'd rested my head the night before. I'd been working late at the warehouse, sorting inventory until well past midnight. The security cameras would confirm my presence there. My supervisor had even commented on my dedication, staying behind to finish the quarterly count. When I finally drove home, the streets were empty except for the occasional delivery truck. The porch light welcomed me back, casting its warm glow across the familiar threshold. But now, standing in this same room while the officers documented everything, I noticed the bookshelf seemed somehow wrong, not obviously disturbed, just subtly off-kilter. The spine of my favorite mystery novel protruded slightly more than usual. Had I pulled it out recently? The memory felt foggy, like trying to recall a dream after waking. The officers asked about my neighbors, whether I'd heard anything unusual. I shook my head, explaining how the surrounding houses were mostly occupied by elderly couples who retired early. Mrs. Henderson next door was practically deaf. The family across the street had been vacationing for weeks. No one would have witnessed anything suspicious, assuming there had been anything to witness at all. Yet something nagged at me, a sensation like déjà vu, but reversed, as if I was experiencing something that hadn't happened yet or remembering something I'd forgotten. The feeling intensified near the kitchen doorway, where the hardwood floor met the tile. I found myself staring at that threshold, though I couldn't explain why. The lead officer, a woman with kind eyes and graying temples, asked me to walk through the evening once more. I recounted my routine, locking the warehouse, driving home through the industrial district, stopping for gas at the 24-hour station. The attendant there knew me well enough to nod in recognition. I'd paid cash, kept the receipt in my wallet, everything documented, everything verifiable. But as I spoke, fragments of another evening began bleeding through. Flashes of standing in this very room, but earlier somehow. The taste of copper in my mouth, the sound of something heavy being dragged across the floor. These sensations felt more real than my carefully constructed timeline, yet they made no logical sense. I touched the wall near the window, and my fingers found a small dent in the plaster I'd never noticed before. Fresh white powder clung to my fingertip. When had that appeared? The officers were busy measuring distances, photographing angles. They didn't see me brush the evidence away, though I'm not sure why I felt compelled to hide it. The afternoon stretched on, filled with questions and forms and the constant scratch of pens on paper. I answered everything honestly, or at least I believed I did. But honesty felt increasingly slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Each time I repeated my story, small details shifted. The time I'd left work, the route I'd taken home, whether I'd spoken to anyone along the way. My hands began to shake, though I attributed it to caffeine and stress. The tremor worsened whenever I looked toward the basement door. That door had always stuck slightly, requiring an extra push to close properly. Now it sat perfectly flush against the frame, as if someone had recently adjusted the hinges. The wood around the lock looked freshly scratched, though the marks were so faint they might have been shadows. I excused myself to use the bathroom, desperate for a moment alone. In the mirror, my reflection looked haggard, older than I remembered. A thin red line marked my collar, as if something had rubbed against my neck. I touched it gingerly, and the contact triggered another flash, hands gripping, pulling, the taste of fear sharp on my tongue. When I returned to the living room, one of the officers was examining the carpet more closely. He'd found the crease I'd noticed earlier, running his gloved fingers along its length. The mark formed a perfect arc, as if something round and heavy had been rolled across the floor. I watched him work, my heart hammering against my ribs, though I couldn't understand my panic. The woman officer asked about my work at the warehouse. What kind of materials did we handle? Did I have access to cleaning supplies, industrial equipment? Her questions felt routine, but each one landed like a physical blow. I explained about the inventory system, the security protocols, the way we tracked every item that came and went. My voice sounded steady, professional, but my palms were slick with sweat. As the afternoon faded into evening, the officers finally began packing their equipment. They thanked me for my cooperation, handed me a case number, explained the next steps in their investigation. I nodded and smiled, playing the role of the concerned citizen, the helpful witness. But underneath, something else was writhing, a knowledge I couldn't access, a truth buried beneath layers of careful construction. After they left, I stood alone in my living room, surrounded by the familiar objects that no longer felt quite right. The silence pressed against my eardrums. I walked to the basement door and tried the handle. It opened smoothly without the usual resistance. The hinges made no sound. I descended the wooden steps, each creak echoing in the darkness below. The basement smelled of concrete and old cardboard, but underneath lay something else, something organic and faintly sweet. I fumbled for the light switch, and when the fluorescent bulbs flickered to life, I saw my workbench exactly as I'd left it, tools arranged in order of size. Paint can stacked against the far wall, everything normal, everything in its place. But the floor looked too clean. The concrete gleamed as if recently scrubbed, though I couldn't remember cleaning it. Near the drain in the corner, I noticed a discoloration darker than the surrounding stone, roughly circular in shape. I knelt and touched the spot. The concrete felt slightly damp, despite the basement's usual dryness. Standing there in the harsh fluorescent light, I felt the two versions of my evening begin to merge. The careful timeline I'd constructed for the officers started to crack, revealing glimpses of something underneath. I saw myself coming home, but not from work. I tasted blood, but not my own. I heard voices, but couldn't make out the words. My legs gave way, and I sank onto the bottom step. The basement walls seemed to pulse with secrets I couldn't quite grasp. Above me, the house creaked and settled, as if adjusting to accommodate a new reality. I closed my eyes and tried to remember what really happened, but the harder I focused, the more elusive the truth became. The officers would return eventually, armed with search warrants and forensic equipment. They would find what I'd hidden or failed to hide or never knew existed in the first place. Until then, I remained suspended between two possibilities, unable to determine which version of myself is real. I climbed the basement stairs and locked the door behind me, though I'm no longer certain what I'm trying to keep contained. The house settles into evening quiet, but the silence feels expectant, as if waiting for me to remember something I've worked very hard to forget. Outside, the streetlights flicker on, casting long shadows through my window's shadows that might be hiding the truth, or might be the truth itself. Story 4. The mat didn't shift as I stepped inside. My shoes left no trace of dust on the pristine surface. It felt as if my weight was inconsequential, absorbed into nothingness. Each footfall was met with an absence of echo, as though the walls themselves had decided not to acknowledge my presence. I moved to the kitchen, the familiar creak in the floorboards conspicuously silent. The refrigerator hummed, but the usual clatter of ice never came. As I reached for the cabinet, its handle was unyieldingly cool, untouched and indifferent. My fingers tingled with doubt. What else had been untouched and ignored? The coffee cup sat exactly where it shouldn't have been. Not on the counter where I'd left it that morning, but centered on the kitchen table, the handle pointing toward the window. Such a small thing, really. The kind of detail that might slip past anyone else, but I'd been watching for weeks now. The liquid inside had formed that thin film you only see when coffee sits undisturbed for hours, yet the mug was still warm. I remember when the watching began, though I can't pinpoint the exact moment suspicion crept in. It might have been the way the mail arrived already sorted, bills on top, advertisements underneath. Or perhaps it was earlier when I noticed the bathroom mirror had been wiped clean of the fingerprints I had left the night before. Small kindnesses, you might call them, acts of care that felt more like surveillance. The house had always been too quiet. Even before I started paying attention to the silences, I knew something was different about the way sound moved through these rooms. Conversation seemed to disappear into the walls rather than bounce back. When I spoke aloud, testing the acoustics, my voice felt swallowed rather than heard. The carpet absorbed footsteps that should have announced arrivals and departures. Even the pipes ran water without their usual protests. She used to hum while doing dishes. I'd forgotten that until I found myself standing at the kitchen sink one evening, my hands moving through soapy water, waiting for a melody that never came. The silence felt deliberate, practiced, like someone had taken great care to eliminate every unnecessary sound, but whose care was it? The photograph on the mantel had been straightened. I know because I'd deliberately left it slightly askew, a small test I'd devised without really acknowledging what I was testing for. The frame now sat perfectly parallel to the shelf's edge, the glass cleaned of the fingerprint I'd pressed against the corner. In the image, two figures stood beside a lake, their faces turned away from the camera, looking toward something beyond the frame's border. I'd studied their posture countless times, searching for clues about what had captured their attention so completely. Memory becomes unreliable when you examine it too closely. I found myself questioning whether I'd actually left the photograph crooked or if that was simply how I wanted to remember it. The coffee cup, too, began to feel uncertain in my mind. Had I really placed it on the counter, or was the table always its home? The more I tried to reconstruct these small moments, the more they seemed to shift and blur, like looking at objects underwater. The basement door was locked, though I couldn't recall ever seeing a key. The wood around the handle bore no scratches, no signs of forced entry or frequent use. When I pressed my ear against the painted surface, I heard nothing but the house's circulation system moving air through hidden ducts. Yet sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking, I imagined I could hear movement below. Not footsteps exactly, but the subtle creaking of floorboards adjusting to weight. I began leaving markers throughout the house. A book open to a specific page, a pen placed at a particular angle, a kitchen towel folded just so. Each morning brought new evidence of disturbance and correction. Pages turned to different chapters, pens returned to drawers, towels refolded with military precision. Someone was maintaining order while I slept, erasing my small rebellions against the house's immaculate state. The watching had become mutual, though I was never certain who had started the game. I would position myself at windows, observing the street for unusual activity, while simultaneously feeling observed from within. The sensation of eyes on my back grew so persistent that I found myself checking mirrors constantly, expecting to catch a glimpse of someone who shouldn't be there. But the reflections showed only empty rooms and my own increasingly hollow expression. Phone calls went unanswered, but the message light never blinked. Mail continued to arrive, sorted and stacked, though I couldn't remember giving anyone permission to handle my correspondence. Bills were paid on time, though I had no memory of writing checks or initiating transfers. My life was being lived with careful efficiency, as if someone else had taken responsibility for its maintenance while I focused on the mystery of their presence. The grocery list on the refrigerator grew longer each day, written in handwriting that looked almost like mine but carried subtle differences. The loops were tighter, the crosses on the T's more precise. Items appeared that I wouldn't have chosen, a particular brand of tea, vegetables I rarely ate, cleaning supplies for tasks I'd never considered necessary. Yet when I opened the pantry, everything I needed was there, arranged with the same careful attention to order that governed the rest of the house. Sleep became elusive as I tried to catch the moment of intervention. I would lie awake listening for the soft sounds of movement, the whisper of papers being organized, the gentle clink of dishes being returned to their proper places. But exhaustion always won, and I would wake to find new evidence of nocturnal activity. A magazine I'd left open was closed and returned to its stack. The thermostat had been adjusted by 2 degrees. Fresh flowers appeared in a vase I didn't recognize. The mirror in the hallway reflected a version of myself that seemed slightly delayed, as if the glass needed a moment to process my image before displaying it. I would wave, and the reflection would follow a heartbeat later. I would smile, and the mirrored expression would appear more genuine than what I felt on my face. Standing before it became a daily ritual, a test of synchronization that I was apparently failing. Neighbors began to feel like strangers, though their faces remained familiar. Conversations carried an undercurrent of knowledge I wasn't privy to, references to events I couldn't recall participating in. They spoke of seeing me at times when I was certain I'd been home, described encounters that felt like descriptions of someone else's life. Their certainty about my activities made me question my own memory of how I spent my days. The calendar on the kitchen wall showed appointments I hadn't made, written in that almost familiar handwriting. Doctor visits, social obligations, errands that needed completing. When I attended these mysterious engagements, people greeted me as if my presence was expected. They referenced previous conversations, shared jokes I didn't remember making, continued discussions that felt like they'd begun without me. I started carrying a small notebook, documenting the discrepancies between my experience and the evidence of my life. But each morning the pages were blank, though I was certain I'd filled them with observations the night before. The pen I used was always returned to the same drawer, its ink level mysteriously replenished. Even my attempts at documentation were being managed, curated, controlled. The basement door remained locked, but I noticed that dust never accumulated on its surface. Someone was cleaning it regularly, maintaining its pristine appearance while keeping its contents hidden. I considered breaking it down, forcing entry into the space below, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the fear of what I might find, or perhaps it was the growing certainty that whatever lay behind that door was already aware of my curiosity. The coffee cup appears again on the table, handle pointing toward the window, the liquid inside bearing that telltale film of hours-old neglect. But this time I remember placing it there myself. The realization comes slowly, like emerging from deep water into harsh light. My fingers find the handle, still warm from my own touch, and I understand that the watching, the waiting, the careful maintenance of order has always been mine. The house hasn't been hiding a presence, it's been revealing an absence. The mat shifts beneath my feet as I step back, finally acknowledging my own weight, finally hearing the echo of my footsteps in rooms that have been empty all along. My fingers tingle with recognition. Everything untouched and ignored has been my own careful construction, a mystery I created to fill the silence of being utterly, completely alone. Story 5. A creak broke the quiet, unexpected and misplaced, as though an unseen weight had shifted just behind me. It came from the direction of the hallway, a sound more fitting for an older house than this one. I stood still, the chill of the kitchen tiles rising through my socks. It echoed again, a whispering groan, softer yet insistent. I moved toward the source, each step reluctant, the air growing thicker, more familiar with each shallow breath I took. The walls seemed closer, the corners defined by a darkness that was less about light and more about memory. Something in this sound, this gently persistent creak, pulled me into a past I couldn't quite see but felt intimately. I knew I hadn't heard it since then. The floorboard. The third plank from the wall always gave way like that, a slow surrender under pressure. I remember learning to avoid it during those careful midnight journeys to the kitchen, stepping wide to the left where the subfloor held firm. But this house shouldn't have that same weakness. The builders assured me of modern construction, engineered joists, premium materials. Yet here it was, that familiar song of wood grain separating, the subtle percussion of a house settling into secrets. I pressed my bare foot against the spot where the sound originated. The board held firm, silent as stone. My weight shifted, testing, but the floor remained solid beneath me. The creak had come from somewhere else entirely. The coffee mug asterisk. It sat on the counter where I'd left it, still warm enough to fog the air above its rim. The ceramic bore a hairline crack along the handle that I'd never noticed before, a flaw that seemed to pulse in the kitchen's dim light. I'd purchased this set after the move, identical white mugs from the department store downtown. Plain, unremarkable, nothing like the chipped blue one that used to sit on a different counter in a different life. But as I lifted it, my fingers found the familiar groove where countless hands had worn the glaze thin. The weight felt wrong, too heavy, as though the porcelain had absorbed something more than coffee. Steam rose between us, carrying a scent that wasn't quite hazelnut, wasn't quite vanilla, but something earthier, more complex, something remembered. The kitchen window. Through the glass, the backyard stretched toward a fence I couldn't see in the darkness. Security lights from neighboring houses created islands of pale yellow, each one ending abruptly at the edge of shadow. I used to stand at another window like this, watching for movement in similar darkness, waiting for the familiar silhouette to cross between streetlights. The view here was different, smaller yard, different angles, but my body remembered the posture, the way my forehead would rest against cool glass, the condensation from my breath creating temporary clouds that would fade and return with each exhale. I wiped the window with my sleeve, but the smudge remained, a fingerprint that wasn't mine, pressed against the outside surface where I couldn't reach it. The refrigerator's hum asterisk. The appliance cycled on with a mechanical shudder, its compressor engaging with the determined efficiency of modern engineering. But underneath that predictable drone, I heard something else, a higher frequency, almost musical, like a voice humming along to a tune only it could hear. I pressed my ear to the stainless steel surface, feeling the vibration travel through my skull. The melody was familiar, something I might have hummed myself while preparing dinner, while waiting for someone to come home, while pretending everything was normal. The refrigerator in the old house had been white, older, with a tendency to ice up in the freezer compartment. This one was different in every measurable way, yet the song remained the same. The dish towel. It hung from the oven handle, perfectly straight, the way I'd arranged it after washing the dinner dishes. Blue and white stripes, machine-washable cotton, purchased with careful attention to matching the kitchen's color scheme. But the fabric felt softer than it should, worn thin in places where hands had twisted it during moments of anxiety, where it had been clutched and released and clutched again. I brought it to my face, breathing in the scent of detergent and fabric softener, but underneath those clean smells lay something else, a faint sweetness, like flowers left too long in water, like perfume that had settled into fibers and refused to wash away no matter how many cycles it endured. The cabinet door. The upper cabinet stood slightly ajar, its door hanging open just wide enough to create a dark gap between the frame and the wood. I didn't remember leaving it that way. My habits were precise, developed over years of maintaining order, of ensuring everything remained in its designated place. I reached up to close it, and the hinges protested with a small squeak, a sound that traveled through the kitchen like a question. Inside, dishes sat in neat rows, white plates stacked according to size, glasses arranged by height. But in the back corner, behind the everyday items, something glinted in the shadow. A piece of china I didn't recognize, decorated with tiny roses, the kind of delicate pattern someone might choose for special occasions, for moments that required more ceremony than my simple routines provided. The light switch asterisk. My fingers found the switch plate without looking, muscle memory guiding them to the familiar rectangle of plastic. But when I pressed upward, the motion felt strange, as though I was expecting the switch to be in a different position, as though my hand remembered a different configuration entirely. The overhead light blazed to life, washing the kitchen in harsh fluorescence that made everything appear slightly overexposed, like a photograph taken with too much flash. I flicked the switch down, then up again, testing the mechanism. Each time the light responded obediently, but my fingers kept searching for something that wasn't there. A dimmer dial, perhaps, or a second switch that controlled a different fixture, one that cast warmer light, one that had illuminated different conversations in a different room. The kitchen table. 4 chairs surrounded the small round table, though I lived alone now and had no need for additional seating. I'd kept them anyway, unable to explain why the empty chairs seemed necessary, why their presence provided a comfort I couldn't name. The table's surface bore the subtle marks of daily use: water rings from glasses, faint scratches from plates and utensils, the accumulated evidence of meals shared and consumed. But in the center, almost invisible unless the light caught it just right, was a deeper gouge, a scar in the wood that formed an irregular line, like something sharp had been dragged across the surface with considerable force. I ran my finger along the mark, feeling its depth, trying to remember when such damage might have occurred. The salt shaker. It sat beside its matching pepper companion, both filled and ready for use. Simple glass containers with silver tops, the kind found in diners and casual restaurants throughout the country. But the salt moved differently when I lifted the shaker, not flowing freely like fresh granules should, but clumping together as though moisture had invaded the container. I unscrewed the top and peered inside. The salt appeared normal, white and crystalline, but it carried a faint gray tinge, as though it had been mixed with something else, something finer, more powdery. I set the shaker down carefully, noting how my hand trembled slightly, how the simple act of examining table condiments had somehow become fraught with significance I couldn't explain. The telephone. The landline sat on its charging base, an anachronism in an age of cellular communication, but I'd insisted on keeping it when I moved. The display showed no missed calls, no waiting messages, just the steady green light that indicated connection to the outside world. I lifted the handset and pressed it to my ear, listening to the dial tone's steady hum. But underneath that electronic constant, I heard something else, a faint crackling, like static from a distant radio station, like voices trying to break through interference. I pressed numbers at random, listening as the tones played their mechanical music, but when I stopped, the silence that followed felt expectant, as though someone on the other end was waiting for me to speak first. The clock on the microwave. The digital display showed the correct time, its red numbers glowing steadily in the kitchen's artificial light. But I found myself staring at it with growing confusion, as though the familiar arrangement of digits had become a foreign language I could no longer interpret. The numbers changed as I watched minutes advancing with mechanical precision, but something about their progression felt wrong, too fast or too slow, as though time itself had become unreliable. I compared it to my wristwatch, to the clock on my phone, finding perfect synchronization among all 3 devices. Yet the feeling persisted that I was missing something crucial, that the real time was hidden somewhere behind the numbers I could see. The kitchen counter asterisk. The surface stretched along the wall, clean and uncluttered, every item in its designated place. Granite composite, chosen for its durability and stain resistance, installed by professionals who guaranteed their work. But as I leaned against it, I felt a subtle give in the material, a flexibility that granite shouldn't possess. I pressed down with both hands, testing the surface's integrity. It held firm under pressure, solid as stone, yet my body remembered a different counter, one made of laminate that had begun to separate at the seams, one that had required careful placement of cutting boards to hide the damage. The muscle memory of accommodation, of working around flaws that couldn't be repaired, remained strong enough to influence how I interacted with this new, perfect surface. The spice rack. Small glass jars lined the wooden rack, each one labeled with neat script that identified its contents. Oregano, basil, thyme, paprika, the essential seasonings for basic cooking, purchased fresh when I'd stocked this kitchen. But several of the jars contained herbs I didn't remember buying, exotic blends with names I couldn't pronounce, their contents dark and mysterious behind clear glass. I unscrewed one lid and inhaled deeply, expecting the sharp bite of dried herbs, but finding instead something floral, almost medicinal, like tea brewed from plants that grew in shadowy places. The scent triggered a memory so vivid I could taste it: a different kitchen, different hands measuring careful amounts into steaming cups, different voices discussing the proper proportions for achieving the desired effect. The drawer pull. My hand reached for the utensil drawer, fingers closing around the brushed nickel handle with automatic precision. But as I pulled, the motion felt rehearsed, as though I'd performed this exact action countless times before in this exact location. The drawer slid open smoothly, revealing the organized compartments where knives and forks and spoons lay in neat rows. Everything appeared normal, functional, recently purchased, and properly arranged. Yet my fingers kept searching for a different handle, one that stuck slightly and required a specific technique to open, one that bore the patina of years of use, of hands that had pulled it open in anger, in haste, in desperate searching for something that might not have been there. The windowsill asterisk. Along the narrow ledge beneath the kitchen window, I'd arranged a few small objects: a decorative ceramic bird, a smooth stone collected from some forgotten beach, a tiny succulent in a clay pot. Simple things chosen for their ability to catch morning light, to provide small points of beauty in an otherwise utilitarian space. But as I examined them more closely, I realized I couldn't remember acquiring any of these items. The bird's glaze showed hairline cracks that spoke of age, of careful handling over many years. The stone bore traces of sand in its crevices, as though it had been recently disturbed from its natural resting place. The succulent's leaves showed signs of careful tending, of regular watering by someone who understood its needs. The dish soap. The bottle stood beside the sink, its familiar shape and color exactly what I'd selected from the store shelf. Lemon scent, antibacterial formula, the same brand I'd used for years. But when I squeezed a small amount onto my palm, the liquid felt different, thicker, more viscous, with an oily quality that clung to my skin. The scent, too, had changed, still citrusy, but with an underlying chemical note that made my eyes water slightly. I read the label carefully, finding all the expected ingredients listed in their proper order, but the formulation seemed altered somehow, as though the familiar bottle now contained something designed to look identical while serving a different purpose entirely. The paper towel roll. It hung from its designated holder, partially used, the perforated edge creating a neat line where the last sheet had been torn away. Standard white paper towels, absorbent and strong, purchased in bulk for economy. But the remaining sheets showed an unusual pattern, a faint watermark or stain that repeated every few squares, like someone had pressed damp hands against the roll at regular intervals. I unrolled several sheets, examining the marks more closely. They weren't random spots, but deliberate impressions, as though someone had been testing the paper's absorbency, or perhaps using it to clean something that left traces behind, something that couldn't be completely removed no matter how much pressure was applied. The garbage disposal. The switch sat beside the main light control, clearly labeled to prevent accidental activation. I'd been careful about what went down the drain, mindful of the manufacturer's warnings about grease and fibrous materials. But when I flipped the switch now, the motor's grinding seemed different, labored, as though it was working against some obstruction I couldn't see. The sound echoed up through the drain with an almost organic quality, like something alive protesting its treatment. I turned off the disposal quickly, but the echo continued for several seconds longer than physics should have allowed, as though the sound was bouncing off surfaces that existed somewhere deeper than the pipes could reach. The ice maker. Inside the freezer compartment, the automatic ice maker performed its mechanical ballet, dropping fresh cubes into the collection bin with soft, irregular thuds. I'd grown accustomed to these sounds, the background percussion of modern convenience, but tonight the rhythm seemed off, too frequent or too sparse, like a heartbeat struggling to maintain its proper cadence. I opened the freezer door and peered inside, finding the ice bin full of perfectly formed cubes, clear and uniform. Yet when I reached for one, it felt warm against my fingers, as though the cold was only surface deep, as though something inside was generating its own heat despite the freezing temperature surrounding it. The kitchen mat asterisk. The small rug lay in front of the sink, positioned to catch drips and provide cushioning for extended periods of standing. I'd chosen it for its simple pattern, its washable fabric, its ability to blend seamlessly with the room's neutral palette. But as I stood on it now, I felt something underneath the surface, a subtle irregularity in the padding that created an uneven texture beneath my feet. I knelt down and lifted one corner, finding nothing unusual about the mat's construction, no hidden objects or damaged areas. Still, the sensation persisted when I stood again, as though my weight was being distributed unevenly, as though the floor itself had developed an imperceptible slope that pulled everything slightly off balance. The final creak. As I prepared to leave the kitchen, the sound returned, that same gentle protest of wood under pressure, that same whispered complaint I'd heard when this investigation began. But now it came from behind me, from the direction I was heading, as though it was leading me forward rather than calling me back. I turned to look over my shoulder, seeing the kitchen exactly as I'd left it, every object in its proper place, every surface clean and orderly. Yet something had shifted in my absence, some subtle rearrangement that I couldn't identify but felt certain had occurred. The creak sounded again, closer now, more insistent, and I realized with growing certainty that I wasn't hearing the house settling into its foundation. I was hearing it wake up, story 6. I mentioned that I hadn't opened the door. The words seemed harmless, etched in thin air, quickly jotted down and accepted without question. Yet as I stood there, the cool breeze from somewhere it shouldn't have reached curled around my ankles. The faint crunch echoed underfoot, a sound only dirt and broken glass could make when undisturbed. A whiff of stale air hung around me, heavy as if the room itself was holding its breath. The sliver of light beneath the door cast wavering shadows that didn't quite make sense, and somehow my fingers felt the cool metal of the handle long after I'd let go. The house had always been too quiet. That's what I told myself when the investigation began, when they asked me to recount everything I could remember. But memory is a peculiar thing, isn't it? It shifts and breathes, reshaping itself each time you touch it. Like water disturbed by a stone, the ripples change the surface until you can't quite recall what the reflection looked like before. I remember the wallpaper in the hallway, faded roses on cream, curling at the edges where moisture had crept in over the years. My grandmother had chosen that pattern, or so I'd been told. The roses seemed to watch as I passed, their petals turned brown at the tips like old photographs left too long in sunlight. Sometimes I would trace their outlines with my fingertip, feeling the slight raised texture of the paper, wondering if she had done the same thing. The detective had kind eyes, the sort that made you want to confess things you'd never done. She sat across from me in the small room with the fluorescent light that hummed just slightly off-key and asked me to start from the beginning. But where was the beginning? Was it the first time I noticed the door was different, or earlier when the sound started? Or perhaps it went back further still, to before I even lived in that house, to decisions made by people I'd never met. I told her about the morning I found the newspaper folded differently. Such a small thing, really. I always folded it in half, then in half again, creasing the edges sharp and clean. But that morning it lay on the kitchen table folded in thirds, the way someone might fold a letter. The coffee was still warm in my cup, steam rising in thin spirals that caught the light from the window. She wrote something in her notebook, the pen scratching against the paper with a sound that reminded me of mice in the walls. I'd heard that sound before, late at night when sleep wouldn't come. Tiny claws against wood, or maybe just the house settling, expanding and contracting with the temperature changes. Old houses do that, I'd read somewhere. They're always moving, always adjusting, never quite still. The door in question led to the basement. I want to be clear about that, though clarity seems to slip away the more I examine it. A plain wooden door painted white with a brass knob that had tarnished over time to a dull gold. The paint was chipped around the edges where hands had gripped it over the years, revealing layers underneath. White over green over what might have been blue, like geological strata telling the story of the house's past. I had opened that door before, of course. Many times. The basement held the usual things: boxes of old books, a washer and dryer, shelves lined with preserves my grandmother had made years ago that no one had the heart to throw away. The jars caught dust and light in equal measure, their contents long since turned to something unrecognizable. But the space felt different each time I descended those wooden steps, as if it rearranged itself when I wasn't looking. The detective asked me about my daily routine. I told her how I would check the locks each night before bed, testing the front door, the back door, the windows on the ground floor. A habit I'd developed after moving into the house alone, though I couldn't remember exactly when it started. The ritual became automatic, my feet finding their way through the dark rooms without conscious thought, my hands knowing which surfaces to touch, which handles to turn. But I never checked the basement door. Why would I? It led nowhere except down into that quiet space filled with memories and forgotten things. Yet sometimes, passing it in the hallway, I would pause. Not because I heard anything or saw anything unusual, but because the silence seemed different, thicker somehow, as if it were listening. The morning I mentioned to the detective wasn't the first time I'd noticed something amiss. Looking back, I can trace a pattern, though at the time each incident seemed isolated, unconnected. The kitchen chair pulled slightly away from the table. The bathroom faucet dripping with a rhythm that didn't match my heartbeat the way it usually did. Small displacements that could be explained by a dozen innocent causes. I began to pay attention in ways I hadn't before. The angle of the lamp shade in the living room, the position of books on the shelf, the way shadows fell across the floor at different times of day. The house revealed itself to be full of subtle variations, tiny changes that might have been happening all along without my notice, or perhaps my increased attention was creating significance where none existed. Sleep became elusive. I would lie in bed listening to the house breathe around me, cataloging each creak and whisper. The refrigerator's hum, the settling of floorboards, the wind against the windows. But underneath these familiar sounds, I began to detect something else. Not quite footsteps, not quite voices, but a presence that seemed to move through the rooms below. The detective asked if I lived alone. Yes, I told her, though the word felt strange in my mouth. Alone implied solitude, but the house never felt empty. It held too much history, too many layers of previous occupants. Their traces lingered in the walls, in the way doors hung slightly crooked, in the patches of floor worn smooth by countless footsteps. I was merely the most recent inhabitant, adding my own small marks to the accumulating record. I started leaving small tests for myself. A coin placed precisely on the edge of a table, a book open to a specific page, a pencil aligned with the grain of the wood, simple markers that would reveal any disturbance, but the results were inconclusive. Sometimes I would find things exactly as I'd left them. Other times, the changes were so subtle I couldn't be certain they were changes at all. The basement door became my focus. I would stand before it in the hallway, studying its surface for signs of recent use. The brass knob showed fingerprints, but they could have been mine from days or weeks before. The threshold beneath showed no obvious footprints, but the floor was dark wood that wouldn't easily reveal such traces. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for movement below, but heard only the distant hum of the water heater. One evening, I decided to test my theory more directly. I took a piece of clear tape and stretched it across the door frame at knee height, invisible unless you knew to look for it. If someone opened the door, the tape would break. It seemed foolproof, a definitive way to know if my suspicions had any basis in reality. The next morning, the tape was gone, not broken, not hanging loose, but completely absent. I searched the floor, thinking it might have fallen, but found nothing. The adhesive residue on the door frame was the only evidence it had ever existed. I stared at those small sticky patches, trying to construct a rational explanation, but my mind kept circling back to the same impossible conclusion. I told the detective about the tape, watching her expression for signs of disbelief or concern. She nodded and made another note, her pen moving across the page with mechanical precision. Her questions were gentle but persistent, probing the edges of my certainty. How could I be sure I'd placed the tape correctly? Might it have fallen off on its own? Could I have removed it myself and forgotten? These possibilities haunted me. Memory, I was learning, was far more fragile than I'd assumed. The harder I tried to pin down specific details, the more they seemed to shift and blur. Had the newspaper really been folded differently, or had I simply folded it differently without thinking? Were the small changes I noticed real, or products of an increasingly anxious mind looking for patterns in randomness? I began keeping a journal, recording each anomaly with precise descriptions and approximate times. The exercise was meant to bring clarity, to establish an objective record that couldn't be distorted by memory's tricks. But reading back over my entries, I found contradictions and uncertainties I didn't remember writing. My own handwriting seemed to argue with itself across the pages. The basement called to me more insistently. I would find myself standing at the door multiple times each day, my hand hovering over the knob. The metal was always cool to the touch, even on warm afternoons when the rest of the house held heat like a held breath. I could feel the space beyond, vast and patient, waiting for me to descend those wooden steps. But I resisted. Some instinct warned me away, though I couldn't articulate why. The basement was just a basement, filled with ordinary objects and ordinary shadows. Yet the thought of opening that door, of breaking the seal between the upper house and the space below, filled me with a dread I couldn't explain or dismiss. The detective asked about my family history, whether anyone else had access to the house. I told her about my grandmother, who had lived there for decades before passing the property to me, about the neighbors who kept spare keys for emergencies, about the previous owners whose names I'd never learned but whose presence lingered in the choices they'd made, the color of the kitchen tiles, the placement of electrical outlets, the decision to finish the basement with wood paneling and fluorescent lights. Each person who had lived in the house had left their mark, layers of intention and habit accumulating like sediment. I was both the latest addition and a temporary custodian, maintaining something larger and more complex than my individual presence. The house contained multitudes, and perhaps what I was experiencing was simply the echo of all those previous lives. The journal entries grew longer and more detailed. I documented not just the anomalies, but the ordinary moments between them. The way morning light fell across the kitchen table, the sound of rain against the bedroom window, the smell of coffee and toast, and the lingering scent of my grandmother's lavender soap that somehow persisted years after her passing. Reading these descriptions later, I was struck by how they revealed my growing isolation. The house had become my entire world, its rhythms and moods more familiar than my own. I realized I hadn't spoken to another person in days, hadn't left the property except for necessary errands. The investigation had become all-consuming, though what exactly I was investigating remained unclear. The detective's questions grew more pointed. She asked about my mental health, my stress levels, whether I was taking any medications that might affect my perception. Her concern was genuine, I could see that, but it also felt like an indictment. The implication that my experiences might be products of an unreliable mind rather than genuine mysteries was both relieving and terrifying. I wanted to show her the basement door, to let her feel the strange coolness of the metal knob and the way the air seemed to move differently around it. But I also feared what she might find, or more accurately, what she might not find. If she saw only an ordinary door leading to an ordinary basement, what would that say about my grip on reality? The house grew quieter as the investigation progressed, as if it were holding back, waiting for the official attention to pass before resuming its subtle activities. I found myself missing the small anomalies that had initially disturbed me. Their absence felt like abandonment, confirmation that I had been imagining things all along. But then, on the night before my final interview with the detective, I heard it clearly. The sound of the basement door opening, the faint creak of hinges that needed oil, followed by footsteps on the wooden stairs. Slow, deliberate steps descending into the darkness below. I lay in bed, paralyzed between fear and vindication, listening to the house reveal its secrets. The footsteps paused, then continued. Not the quick, purposeful movement of an intruder, but the careful navigation of someone familiar with the space. Someone who knew which steps creaked and how to avoid them, which support beams hung low enough to require ducking. Someone who belonged there as much as I did, or perhaps more. I didn't investigate that night. Instead, I pulled the covers over my head like a child afraid of monsters and waited for dawn. When morning came, I found the basement door closed, the brass knob reflecting the hallway light as if nothing had happened. But the air smelled different, stirred and displaced, carrying traces of dust and old wood and something else I couldn't identify. The detective listened to my account with the same patient attention she'd shown throughout our conversations. She asked the expected questions about dreams and sleep states, about the possibility that I'd heard the house settling or the water heater cycling on. Her skepticism was professional rather than dismissive, but it still stung. After she left, I stood alone in the hallway, facing the basement door. The investigation was over, the official record closed, but my questions remained unanswered. I reached for the brass knob, feeling its familiar coolness against my palm. This time I turned it. The door opened with that same faint creak I'd heard in the night. Beyond lay the wooden stairs descending into shadows, the basement waiting with its boxes and shelves and accumulated memories. I took one step down, then another, my feet finding the worn spots where countless others had walked before me. The basement was exactly as I remembered it, yet somehow different. The air moved differently, carrying scents I recognized but couldn't place. The fluorescent lights hummed their off-key tune, casting harsh shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. And in the corner, behind a stack of boxes I was certain I'd never moved, I glimpsed something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the house and my place in it. But that's another story, isn't it? Or perhaps it's the same story, told from a different angle with different emphasis and different omissions. Memory is unreliable, perception is subjective, and truth is often more complex than we want to admit. The basement holds its secrets still, and I've learned to live with the uncertainty. Now standing here again in this familiar hallway, I feel that cool breeze curling around my ankles, hear the faint crunch of dirt and broken glass underfoot. The sliver of light beneath the door casts the same wavering shadows, and my fingers remember the cool metal of the handle. I mentioned that I hadn't opened the door, but perhaps that was never entirely true. Perhaps some doors open themselves, revealing not answers but deeper questions, not resolution but the acceptance of mystery. The house breathes around me, patient and eternal, holding its stories close. And I remain both investigator and subject, observer and participant, forever circling the same questions, forever drawn back to this door and the secrets it guards. The cool metal waits beneath my fingers, familiar as my own heartbeat, cold as truth, warm as lies, real as anything in this shifting world of memory and shadow. Story 7. The Scent of Secret. It smelled like cigarette smoke, a lingering, stale presence that clung to the air when it had no business being there. I stood in the hallway, the walls pressing closer with each breath, trying to pinpoint its source. The scent was undeniable, curling into my senses, dredging up a memory blurred at the edges. I hesitated at the threshold of my own room, the aroma thickening, layering over the scent of dust and paper. My gaze snagged on the empty vase by the window, its glass catching the gray light. I knew that smell from somewhere where secrets were whispered too loudly and the past refused to stay put. It shouldn't be here now, but it was, wrapping around me like a forgotten promise. I hadn't smelled that since before everything changed, but here it was, and I couldn't walk away. The cigarette smoke belonged to her, my sister, the one who vanished on a Tuesday morning while the coffee was still warm in her mug, the one whose case file had grown thick with unanswered questions and cold leads, the one whose disappearance had torn our family apart, leaving behind only fragments of a life that seemed more mysterious with each passing season. I found myself drawn back to her room, a space I'd avoided for months after the police finished their initial search. The smell was strongest here, as if she'd just stepped out for a moment, but that was impossible. She'd been gone for over a year now, and no one had been in this room except me. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved toward her desk. Everything appeared exactly as she'd left it, notebooks stacked with military precision, pens arranged in perfect rows, a half-finished crossword puzzle folded beside her laptop. The police had photographed everything, cataloged every item, but they'd missed something. They always missed something. I pulled open the top drawer, my fingers trembling slightly. Inside, beneath a layer of receipts and ticket stubs, I found a small leather journal I'd never seen before. The cover was worn smooth, as if it had been handled countless times. When I opened it, the cigarette smell intensified, and I realized the pages had absorbed the scent from her fingers. Her handwriting filled every page, but these weren't the neat, controlled letters I remembered. These words sprawled across the paper in urgent, sometimes frantic strokes. As I read, my understanding of my sister began to shift, like a photograph slowly developing in a darkroom. She'd been investigating something, someone. The entries spoke of meetings in parking lots, conversations that ended abruptly, and a growing sense that she was being watched. She mentioned a man she called the Collector, someone who seemed to know things about people that they'd rather keep hidden, someone who used that knowledge to get what he wanted. The journal entries painted a picture of a woman I didn't recognize. My sister had always been cautious, methodical, but these pages revealed someone willing to take dangerous risks, someone who'd stumbled onto something that frightened her. The final entry, dated just 3 days before she disappeared, consisted of only 4 words: "He knows I know." I sat on her bed, the journal heavy in my hands, and tried to reconcile this revelation with the sister I thought I knew. The police had treated her disappearance as a voluntary departure. A young woman overwhelmed by life, they'd suggested, who decided to start fresh somewhere else. Her bank account had been emptied, her car found abandoned at a bus station. Case closed as far as they were concerned. But the journal suggested something far more sinister. I spent the following days poring over every entry, trying to decode the references and piece together the timeline of her investigation. She'd been tracking a pattern of disappearances, young women who'd vanished under circumstances similar to her own, women whose cases had been quickly closed, whose families had been told they'd simply chosen to leave their old lives behind. The collector, according to her notes, was methodical. He targeted women who were isolated, vulnerable women who wouldn't be missed immediately. He studied them, learned their routines, their weaknesses, and then he made them disappear. My sister had gotten too close to the truth. I found myself retracing her steps, visiting the places mentioned in her journal. The coffee shop where she'd met with sources, the library where she'd researched old newspaper articles, the parking garage where she'd conducted her final interview with someone she identified only as the insider. At the coffee shop, the barista remembered her, a regular customer who always ordered the same drink and sat in the corner booth, always writing in a small notebook. She'd seemed nervous during her last few visits, the barista recalled, constantly checking over her shoulder, jumping at sudden noises. The librarian at the reference desk had a similar memory. She'd spent hours in the newspaper archives, printing articles about missing persons cases going back several years. She'd asked specific questions about accessing police reports and court records. The librarian had been impressed by her thoroughness, her dedication to whatever story she was researching. But it was at the parking garage that I found the first real clue. The security guard, an older man with tired eyes, remembered the incident clearly. A young woman matching my sister's description had approached him, asking about the surveillance cameras and whether the footage was stored. She'd seemed agitated, he said, kept looking around as if she expected someone to appear. She'd given him a business card and asked him to call if anyone came asking questions about her. The guard still had the card. It wasn't my sister's name on it, but a pseudonym she'd apparently been using during her investigation. The phone number was disconnected now, but the address led me to a storage unit across town. The unit was small, barely large enough for a few boxes, but what I found inside changed everything. My sister had been building a case file that put the police investigation to shame. Photos, documents, timelines, maps marking the locations where women had disappeared. She'd identified a pattern that spanned multiple jurisdictions, a web of disappearances that had gone unnoticed because no one had been looking at the bigger picture. At the center of it all was a name, the man she'd been tracking, the one she called the collector. She discovered his real identity, his address, even his work schedule. But more disturbing than that, she'd figured out his method. He worked in property management with access to rental records and tenant information. He could track when leases were ending, when women were moving, when they were most vulnerable. He inserted himself into their lives gradually, offering help, creating dependency, isolating them from their support systems. And when they were completely alone, completely dependent on him, he made them vanish. The final box contained something that made my hands shake as I held it. A recording device, small enough to fit in a pocket, with a single file saved on it. My sister's voice, clear and determined, speaking to someone whose responses were barely audible. "I know what you did to them," she said. "I have proof." The other voice was calm, almost amused. "You don't understand the situation you've put yourself in." "I understand perfectly. You prey on vulnerable women. You isolate them, control them, and when they try to leave, you make sure they can't." "And what exactly do you plan to do with this understanding?" "I'm going to stop you." There was a long pause, filled only with the sound of breathing and distant traffic. When the man spoke again, his voice had changed. The amusement was gone, replaced by something cold and final. "No," he said simply, "you're not." The recording ended there. I sat in that storage unit, surrounded by evidence of my sister's courage and determination, and felt the weight of what she'd discovered. She'd been so close to exposing him, so close to getting justice for all those women, but she'd underestimated how dangerous he truly was. I knew I should take everything to the police, but I also knew what would happen. They dismiss it as the obsessive delusions of a troubled woman. They'd already decided she'd left voluntarily, and nothing in these boxes would change their minds. The collector was too careful, too methodical. He'd covered his tracks too well. But my sister had taught me something important in those final recordings. She'd shown me that someone had to care enough to look, to dig deeper, to refuse to accept the easy answers. Someone had to speak for the women who could no longer speak for themselves. I began my own investigation, picking up where she'd left off. I learned to move carefully, to watch for signs I was being watched. I changed my routines, varied my routes, told no one what I was doing. I studied the collector's patterns, his hunting grounds, his methods. And slowly, I began to understand why my sister had been so frightened in those final days. He was still out there, still hunting, still collecting. The cigarette smoke in my house hadn't been my imagination or some lingering trace of my sister's presence. Someone had been there, someone who smoked the same brand she had, someone who wanted me to know he could reach me whenever he chose. I found the first note tucked under my windshield wiper after a late evening at the library. Simple, direct, stop looking. The second appeared in my mailbox. Your sister couldn't leave well enough alone either. The third was waiting on my kitchen table when I came home from work, and I knew then that locks and security systems meant nothing to him. He could reach me anywhere, anytime, just as he'd reached all the others. But I also knew something he might not have expected. I wasn't going to stop. My sister had died trying to expose him, and her courage lived on in the evidence she'd gathered, in the truth she'd uncovered. Her investigation had become my investigation, her mission my mission. I began leaving my own recordings in safe places, my own evidence caches that would be found if something happened to me. I documented everything, every connection I made, every piece of the puzzle I put together. If I disappeared, someone else would eventually pick up the trail. Because that's what my sister had taught me in those final, desperate entries in her journal. The truth doesn't die with one person. It lives on in the evidence, in the questions that refuse to be silenced, in the people who care enough to keep looking. The collector might have silenced her voice, but he couldn't silence the truth she'd uncovered. And he couldn't silence me, no matter how many notes he left, no matter how many times he let himself into my house to leave behind the scent of cigarettes and fear. I know he's watching me now, waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity. I know he's planning to make me disappear just as he made her disappear, just as he made all of them disappear. But I also know something else. I know who he is, where he lives, how he operates. I know about the storage facility where he keeps his trophies, about the rental properties he uses as hunting grounds, about the network of contacts who help him cover his tracks. And unlike my sister, I'm not working alone anymore. The evidence is out there now, in the hands of people who won't let it be buried or dismissed. People who understand that some truths are worth dying for. The smell of cigarette smoke still haunts my house, still follows me through my days and into my dreams, but it no longer frightens me the way it once did. Now it reminds me of her courage, her determination, her refusal to let evil hide in the shadows. It reminds me that some promises are worth keeping, no matter the cost. And I promised her in that storage unit, surrounded by the evidence of her final investigation, that her death wouldn't be in vain, that the women she'd tried to save would finally get the justice they deserved, that the collector's hunting days were numbered. The cigarette smoke is getting stronger now, and I can hear footsteps in the hallway outside my room. He's come for me just as I knew he would, but this time he won't find a frightened, isolated woman who can disappear without a trace. This time he'll find someone who's ready for him. Someone who knows exactly who he is and what he's done. Someone who's made sure the truth will survive no matter what happens next. The doorknob is turning now, and I can see his shadow under the door, but I'm not afraid anymore. My sister's courage flows through me, and her truth will outlive us both. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. Some voices refuse to be silenced. And sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. Story 8. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing the room in muted anticipation. The air was dense, almost palpable, as if holding its breath. My fingers brushed against the edge of the table, lingering on a forgotten trace of dust. The faint scent of stale coffee clung to the air, mingling with an unfamiliar metallic tang. I hesitated, every nerve on edge, sensing the faint echo of a disturbance. Everything appeared still, yet nothing seemed in place. The tension in the room was a thin veil, and just beyond it, something waited to be discovered. The coffee mug sat exactly where it always did, 3 inches from the corner of the desk, handle turned at precisely 90 degrees. I had watched this ritual for months, the careful placement, the measured distance, the obsessive alignment. But today the ceramic showed a hairline crack running from rim to base, a fissure I had never noticed before. The brown stain inside had dried to an unusual darkness, almost black, nothing like the light roast that was preferred. My throat tightened as I realized I couldn't remember seeing anyone drink from this cup in weeks. The calendar on the wall displayed a month that felt both recent and impossibly distant. Red circles marked certain dates with an urgency that made my palms sweat. The handwriting looked familiar yet somehow altered, as if someone had tried to mimic a style they knew well but couldn't quite capture. 3 dates bore additional marks, small X's in black ink that seemed to pulse with significance I couldn't grasp. I found myself counting the days between each marked date, discovering a pattern that made my stomach clench with recognition. The photograph on the bookshelf had been turned face down. I knew this image by heart, 5 people standing in front of a building, smiling with the kind of forced cheer that comes from mandatory gatherings. But when I lifted the frame, the glass was spiderwebbed with cracks, and something dark had seeped behind it, obscuring 2 of the faces completely. The remaining figures seemed to stare out with expressions I didn't remember, their smiles now appearing strained, almost fearful. My own face among them looked like a stranger's. The filing cabinet drawer hung open by mere inches, just enough to reveal the manila folders within. Each tab bore a single initial in that same almost familiar handwriting. The folders were arranged alphabetically, but one was missing from the sequence, the one that should have contained my initial. I found it at the back of the drawer, significantly thicker than the others, stuffed with documents I didn't recognize. Insurance forms, medical records, correspondence with letterheads that sent chills down my spine. My name appeared throughout, but the signature at the bottom of each page looked nothing like my own hand. The desk lamp cast shadows that seemed wrong for the time of day. The bulb flickered intermittently, creating a strobe effect that made everything appear to move when it should have been still. In these moments of alternating light and darkness, I caught glimpses of things that shouldn't have been there: smears on the wall, scuff marks on the floor, indentations in the carpet that suggested furniture had been moved recently. The rhythm of the flickering matched my heartbeat, as if the room itself had learned to pulse with my growing anxiety. The wastebasket contained only a single crumpled paper, but when I smoothed it out, I found my own handwriting covering both sides. The words made no sense in sequence, fragments of thoughts, partial sentences, what looked like attempts to remember something important. Tuesday was different appeared multiple times, along with the sound from upstairs, and why didn't anyone else notice? At the bottom, in letters pressed so hard they had torn through the paper, was written, "I have to write this down before I forget again." Bookshelf held volumes I remembered purchasing, but their arrangement defied logic. Books I had finished were mixed with those I had never opened. Several had bookmarks placed in identical positions, page 127, regardless of their length or content. When I opened one to that page, I found passages highlighted in yellow, creating messages that made my blood run cold. Someone had been using my books to communicate, leaving breadcrumbs of meaning scattered across different texts. The highlighted words spelled out warnings I wasn't sure I wanted to understand. The window blind was tilted at an angle that allowed only slivers of light to enter, creating prison bar shadows across the floor. Through the gaps, I could see the parking lot where my car sat in its usual spot. But the vehicle looked different somehow, the bumper dented in a way I couldn't recall, the rear window sporting a crack that spread like a web. Most disturbing was the yellow notice tucked under the windshield wiper, official-looking and ominous. I had no memory of receiving any warnings or violations. The telephone on the desk showed 17 missed calls, all from the same number. I recognized the digits but couldn't place them in my memory. The voicemail light blinked insistently, but when I pressed play, I heard only breathing and the sound of someone crying softly. The timestamp indicated the calls had come in during hours when I should have been present, yet I had no recollection of the phone ringing. The final message contained a whispered voice that sounded disturbingly like my own, saying words I was certain I had never spoken. The chair I sat in daily bore impressions that didn't match my body. The wear patterns suggested someone larger, heavier, had been using this space regularly. The armrests showed scratches and gouges, as if fingernails had clawed desperately at the leather during moments of extreme stress. Caught in the seam between cushions, I found strands of hair in a color that wasn't quite mine, similar enough to be mistaken, different enough to raise questions about who else had been sitting here, living what I thought was my life. The air conditioning vent above my head rattled with a sound that had become so constant I usually didn't notice it. But today the noise seemed different, more deliberate, almost like Morse code. As I listened, I began to detect a pattern: 3 short bursts, 3 long ones, 3 short again. The universal distress signal, repeating endlessly above my head. I wondered how long this message had been playing, and whether I was the intended recipient or if someone else was trying to communicate through the walls and ducts of this building. The carpet beneath my feet showed a trail of darker spots leading from the door to the desk. In the flickering light of the malfunctioning lamp, these stains took on a reddish hue that made my mouth go dry. I knelt to examine them more closely and caught a scent that the stale coffee couldn't quite mask something organic and troubling. The spots formed a perfect line, as if something had been dragged across the floor, leaving evidence that someone had tried but failed to clean completely. The desk drawer contained items I didn't remember placing there, a set of keys to locks I couldn't identify, receipts for purchases I hadn't made, and a small digital recorder that felt warm to the touch, as if recently used. When I pressed play, my own voice emerged, discussing events I had no memory of experiencing. I described meetings with people whose names meant nothing to me, detailed conversations that felt like fiction, and expressed emotions, fear, anger, desperation that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. The mirror on the wall reflected a room that looked almost right but contained subtle differences that accumulated into wrongness. The furniture appeared to be in slightly different positions, the shadows fell at impossible angles, and my own reflection seemed delayed, as if the glass needed a moment to decide what to show me. Most unsettling was the figure that occasionally appeared at the edge of the reflection, someone standing just behind me, visible only in peripheral vision, vanishing whenever I turned around. The final element that caught my attention was the door itself, the same door that had clicked shut when I entered. The lock was engaged from the inside, but I had no memory of turning it. The wood around the handle showed fresh scratches, and the metal appeared bent, as if someone had tried to force their way either in or out. As I reached for the handle, I noticed my hand was trembling, and I couldn't tell if it was from fear of what lay beyond the door, or terror at the possibility that I might not be able to leave this room that held so many versions of a truth I was no longer certain I wanted to discover. Story 9. I assured them it was nothing important, just an ordinary, uneventful night. The chill in the air pressed against my skin, seeping through the fabric of my jacket as I stood in the narrow alley. Its familiar dampness clung to me, a subtle reminder that I had lingered there longer than I had planned. My eyes darted over the scattered papers on the ground, their edges curling like tendrils reaching for answers. The glint of a small, forgotten watch caught my gaze, a silent witness submerged in a pool of streetlight. Above, a window creaked, its noise lost in the hum of distant traffic. They never asked about the smudge on my collar, the one that didn't come from my hands, not that I would have told them. The watch face reflected nothing but shadow when I first noticed it weeks before, though I can't pinpoint exactly when the awareness began. Memory has a way of reshaping itself, doesn't it? Like water finding new channels through familiar ground. I remember the weight of observation, that persistent sense of being catalogued, measured, understood in ways I hadn't consented to. She had a habit of checking her wrist even when she wasn't wearing a watch, a nervous gesture perhaps, or something deeper. I found myself studying the motion during our conversations, those careful exchanges that felt choreographed, as if we were both following scripts neither of us had written. Her fingers would press against that bare spot where metal should have rested, and I wondered what time she was trying to measure. The apartment building held its secrets close, thin walls, thinner pretenses. I could hear footsteps in the unit above mine, always at the same hour, always following the same pattern. 3 steps to the window, pause, 7 steps toward what I assumed was the kitchen. The rhythm became a metronome for my own restlessness. Sometimes I found myself synchronizing my movements with those sounds, as if we were dancers in separate rooms, connected by the architecture of surveillance. But I'm getting ahead of myself, or perhaps behind. The linear progression of events seems less important now than the texture of understanding, the way certainty eroded like shoreline under persistent waves. There was a photograph tucked between pages of a book. She'd lent me a casual gesture that felt anything but casual. The image showed a street corner I recognized, taken from an angle that suggested the photographer had been standing exactly where I often waited for the bus. Coincidence wears many masks. I told myself this as I studied the composition, the deliberate framing that captured not just the intersection but the bench where I sat most mornings, reading or pretending to read while watching the flow of strangers. In the photograph's background, a figure in a dark jacket stood with their back to the camera. The posture was familiar in a way that made my chest tighten. The book itself was unremarkable, a collection of essays about urban planning, the kind of text that might sit on anyone's shelf. But I found myself returning to it repeatedly, searching for other hidden artifacts. The margins contained penciled notes in her careful handwriting, observations about pedestrian patterns and sight lines that seemed to transform innocent academic interest into something more purposeful. I began to map the connections, real or imagined. The coffee shop where we'd met, positioned perfectly to observe the entrance to my building. The casual questions about my schedule, woven so naturally into conversation that I'd answered without thinking. The way she always seemed to arrive at places just before I did, as if she'd been waiting. Trust is a delicate instrument, easily calibrated by small adjustments. I found mine shifting in response to accumulated details that might have meant nothing individually, but formed a pattern when viewed from the right distance, or perhaps the wrong distance. Perspective has its own gravitational pull, drawing conclusions toward whatever mass of suspicion has already formed. The alley became a testing ground for theories I couldn't quite articulate. I would stand there in the evenings, ostensibly taking a shortcut home, but really conducting experiments in visibility. Which windows offered views of my position? How long could I remain stationary before someone might notice? The scattered papers on the ground changed configuration regularly, suggesting foot traffic I never witnessed directly. Her watch, for I had convinced myself it was hers, remained where I'd first spotted it, untouched by weather or scavengers. This seemed significant, though I struggled to define the nature of that significance. Objects have their own logic, their own reasons for persisting or disappearing. Perhaps it was waiting for the right moment to reveal its purpose. The smudge on my collar appeared after one of those evening vigils, a mark I discovered only when changing clothes. Dark, roughly circular, positioned where someone might have placed a finger while standing close behind me. I had no memory of such contact, no recollection of anyone approaching near enough to leave evidence of their presence. Yet there it was, stubborn and inexplicable, refusing to wash out completely. Sleep became an unreliable ally. I would lie in bed listening to those footsteps above, trying to decode their meaning. The pattern had evolved, become more complex. Now there were pauses in unexpected places, sounds that suggested someone standing motionless for extended periods. I imagined eyes pressed to windows, surveying the street below, cataloging the movements of residents who believed themselves unobserved. The photograph haunted my thoughts with increasing persistence. I studied it through a magnifying glass borrowed from a neighbor, searching for details that might confirm or dispel my growing certainty. The figure in the background remained frustratingly ambiguous, too distant for clear identification, yet familiar enough to trigger recognition. I measured shadows, estimated angles, tried to determine the exact time of day the image had been captured. She stopped asking about my schedule, which somehow felt more ominous than her previous curiosity. Our conversations became carefully neutral, drained of the subtle probing that had once characterized our interactions. This shift might have been reassuring if I hadn't begun to suspect it meant her surveillance had become sophisticated enough to operate without my cooperation. I started varying my routines, taking different routes home, shopping at unfamiliar stores. But the city has its own patterns, currents that draw pedestrians toward certain intersections regardless of their intended destinations. I found myself repeatedly in locations that offered clear views of my building, my usual haunts, the places where my life had worn grooves into the urban landscape. The watch face caught different qualities of light depending on atmospheric conditions. On clear evenings, it reflected the street lamp with mirror-like precision. During overcast weather, it seemed to absorb illumination, becoming a dark pool that suggested depths beyond its actual dimensions. I began to check on it regularly, noting these variations as if they constituted a form of communication. Memory plays its own games with chronology. I can no longer determine whether my suspicions preceded the evidence or grew from it. The boundary between observation and paranoia has blurred beyond recognition. Perhaps there was never a boundary at all, just different names for the same fundamental uncertainty about the intentions of others. The building's architecture revealed new possibilities for observation the longer I studied it. Windows aligned in ways that created sight lines between floors, reflective surfaces that might serve as mirrors for watching without being seen. I found myself moving through my apartment with heightened awareness of these potential viewing angles, adjusting my behavior to account for eyes that might or might not have been present. Her absence became as significant as her presence had been. Days passed without contact, without the casual encounters that had once punctuated my routine. I caught myself looking for her in crowds, scanning faces for features that had become encoded in my visual memory. The search felt both necessary and futile, driven by needs I couldn't adequately name. The papers in the alley shifted position with each visit, but I began to notice they weren't simply scattered randomly. Certain pages appeared repeatedly in specific locations, as if someone was arranging them according to a system I hadn't yet deciphered. I resisted the urge to examine them closely, sensing that such investigation might constitute a form of participation in whatever process was unfolding. Coincidence accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of small correspondences that might have meant everything or nothing. A car parked outside my building that matched one I'd seen near the coffee shop. A pedestrian whose gait reminded me of footsteps I'd heard in hallways. These fragments of potential connection floated in my consciousness, refusing to coalesce into certainty or dissolve into insignificance. The photograph's hiding place in the book suggested premeditation, but of what kind? Perhaps it had been placed there deliberately for me to find, a test of my observational skills or paranoid tendencies. Or perhaps its presence was entirely innocent, a bookmark forgotten between pages, and my discovery of meaning where none existed revealed more about my state of mind than about any external threat. I found myself returning to that alley with increasing frequency, drawn by the promise of revelation that never quite materialized. The watch remained constant while everything else shifted around it: papers, shadows, the quality of light filtering down from windows above. Its persistence began to feel like patience, as if it were waiting for me to understand something I remained incapable of grasping. The smudge on my collar had faded but never disappeared completely, a ghost of contact that reminded me of vulnerabilities I hadn't previously considered. How many times had I been close enough to someone for them to mark me without my awareness? How many traces of such encounters had I failed to notice, washing away evidence of surveillance disguised as accident? Trust, once compromised, becomes a liability rather than a gift. I found myself questioning interactions that had seemed perfectly natural, searching for hidden agendas in casual conversation, interpreting kindness as potential manipulation. This transformation felt both necessary and tragic, a form of protection that isolated me from the very connections I sought to preserve. The city revealed its surveillance infrastructure gradually, like a developing photograph. Security cameras, reflective windows, sight lines between buildings, all the ways we observe and are observed in the course of ordinary urban existence. I began to move through these spaces with the consciousness of someone who understood they were always potentially visible, always subject to documentation by systems both official and improvised. Her questions had been so skillfully integrated into natural conversation that I only recognized their pattern in retrospect. Inquiries about my work schedule, my preferred routes home, my habits and preferences, information that could have been collected out of genuine interest or for purposes I was only beginning to imagine. The ambiguity itself might have been intentional, a way of maintaining plausible deniability while gathering intelligence. The watch face reflects the streetlight now as I stand here again, its surface a mirror that shows me my own eyes staring back. The papers have arranged themselves into new configurations, and somewhere above a window creaks with the same rhythm I remember from before. The smudge on my collar has returned, though I have no memory of how it got there. They never asked about it, and I never told them, but perhaps that was never the point. Perhaps the point was simply this: to stand in the narrow alley, feeling the familiar dampness cling to my skin, understanding that some questions answer themselves by being asked, and some watches keep time that has nothing to do with hours or minutes, but with the patient rhythm of observation itself. Story 10. My fingertips brushed the edge of the wooden table as I stepped back. The varnish had always felt smooth, but today my skin caught on something, a slight disruption in the familiar surface. I paused, letting my breath settle, aware of an unusual stillness enveloping the room. The air seemed denser, as if holding its own secret beneath the everyday hum. I turned towards the window, only to notice the curtains swaying gently without a breeze. The sensation lingered, telling me that nothing was quite as it seemed. But I knew what had happened here. The story was simple enough, really. My colleague had been working late that evening, just as she always did when the quarterly reports were due. She'd stayed behind after everyone else had gone home, the building settling into its familiar nighttime quiet. The security footage showed her entering the office around 7 in the evening, her usual determined stride carrying her past the reception desk and toward the elevator. She'd been found the next morning by the cleaning crew, slumped over her desk in what appeared to be exhaustion. The paramedics said her heart had simply given out. Stress, they explained. Too many late nights, too much coffee, too much pressure from management to deliver results that seemed increasingly impossible to achieve. It made perfect sense to all of us who'd watched her burning herself out month after month, refusing offers of help or suggestions to delegate. The funeral was small but respectful. Her sister spoke about dedication and work ethic, about someone who never knew when to quit. We all nodded, understanding. In our line of work, we'd seen it before. People pushed themselves until something broke, and sometimes that something was irreparable. I returned to the office the following week with a clear conscience and a practical mindset. Her desk needed to be cleared, her files transferred to the appropriate departments, her projects redistributed among the remaining staff. Management asked me to handle it, given that we'd worked closely together on several accounts. It seemed like the natural choice. That's when I first touched the table, running my hand along its surface while sorting through her papers. The wood had always been pristine. She'd been meticulous about keeping her workspace clean. but something felt different under my fingertips, something that hadn't been there before. At first, I dismissed it. Wood changes, especially in an old building where temperature and humidity fluctuate with the seasons. Materials expand and contract, surfaces develop character over time. I continued organizing her files, boxing up personal items, making neat piles of documents that would need to be reviewed by various departments. But as the days passed, I found myself returning to that spot on the table, pressing my palm against the wood, feeling for that subtle irregularity. It was barely noticeable, just a slight roughness in an otherwise smooth surface, like something had been scraped against it, or perhaps something had been scraped away. The more I thought about it, the more I began to question what I remembered about that final evening. I'd left the office around 6, I was certain of that, but had I actually seen her arrive? The security footage showed her entering at 7, but I couldn't recall passing her in the lobby or the parking structure. We usually exchanged pleasantries when our schedules overlapped, a brief conversation about deadlines or weekend plans, but that evening there had been no such interaction. I started paying closer attention to the details I'd previously overlooked. The position of her chair, for instance. She always pushed it neatly under her desk before leaving, a habit that had occasionally annoyed others who were less organized. But when she'd been found, the chair was several feet away from the desk, angled awkwardly as if she'd stood up suddenly and never had the chance to straighten it. The papers on her desk had been scattered too, not arranged in her usual precise stacks. Her coffee cup was empty, but there was no ring stain on the wood where she typically placed it. Instead, there was a faint watermark near the edge of the desk, close to where my fingers kept finding that rough patch in the varnish. I began to notice other inconsistencies. Her jacket had been draped over the back of a different chair, not hanging on the coat hook she always used. Her computer was still logged in, displaying a document she'd been working on, but the timestamp showed activity well past the time the coroner estimated she'd died. The cursor was blinking in the middle of a sentence, as if she'd stopped typing mid-thought. The building's security guard mentioned that he'd heard voices from our floor that evening, which had struck him as odd since the log showed only one person had badged in after hours. When I pressed him for details, he shrugged and said sound carried strangely in the building at night, voices echoing from other floors or drifting in from the street below. He hadn't thought much of it at the time. But I found myself thinking about it constantly. Voices, plural, not the sound of someone working alone, making phone calls or perhaps talking to herself as she often did when concentrating on difficult problems. Actual conversation, the back and forth rhythm of two people engaged in discussion. I started staying late myself, listening to the building's nighttime sounds. The heating system clicked and hummed. Elevators moved between floors, summoned by cleaning crews or security personnel. Footsteps echoed in the stairwells, though I could never determine their source or direction. The building was never truly empty, never completely silent. One evening, while organizing the last of her files, I noticed something I'd missed before. A small appointment book tucked beneath a stack of invoices. Her handwriting was neat and precise, just like everything else about her work habits. Most entries were routine, meetings, deadlines, conference calls. But there was one notation that caught my attention, written for the evening she died. It was just an initial, followed by a time. Not 7 o'clock when the security footage showed her entering the building, but 8:30. The initial wasn't familiar to me, though something about the way she'd written it suggested urgency. The pen had pressed deeper into the paper, creating small indentations on the page beneath. I found myself studying the handwriting, comparing it to other entries in the book. The formation of letters was consistent, but the pressure varied. Some appointments were noted casually, others with obvious emphasis. The final entry fell into the latter category, marked with an importance that contradicted the simple initial and time. That's when I began to reconsider the timeline entirely. If she'd arrived at 7 but had an appointment at 8:30, she hadn't been planning to work alone that evening. Someone else was supposed to join her, someone whose identity she'd reduced to a single letter in her private notes. I started looking at her recent projects differently, searching for connections I might have missed. She'd been working on a complex audit, reviewing financial records that stretched back several years. The work required discretion and attention to detail, qualities she possessed in abundance. But it also required access to sensitive information, the kind that might make certain people uncomfortable if irregularities were discovered. The rough patch on the wooden table began to feel more significant. I brought a small flashlight to work and examined the surface more carefully. The disruption in the varnish formed a pattern, not random wear but deliberate scoring, as if something had been scraped back and forth across the wood with considerable force. I tried to imagine what could have caused such marks. A struggle seemed too dramatic, inconsistent with the medical examiner's findings. But perhaps a heated discussion, someone leaning heavily on the desk, a briefcase or folder being dragged across the surface in frustration or emphasis. The water stain near the edge of the table suggested a spilled drink, but her usual coffee cup had been found empty and properly positioned. Someone else's beverage, then. A second person who'd been present that evening, whose presence wasn't reflected in the security logs or the official timeline. I began to feel watched during my late evening investigations, not by security cameras or building personnel, but by something less tangible. The sensation of being observed, of having my actions noted and evaluated by unseen eyes. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, checking corners and doorways for movement that never materialized. The curtains in the office moved frequently now, responding to air currents I couldn't identify. The building's ventilation system seemed more active at night, creating subtle drafts that stirred papers and shifted lightweight objects. But the movement felt purposeful somehow, as if the building itself were trying to communicate something I wasn't quite ready to understand. I started questioning my own memories more seriously. Had I really left at 6 that evening, or had I stayed later? My parking receipt showed a departure time, but those machines were notoriously unreliable. My keycard records could be checked, but I hesitated to make such a request without a compelling reason to offer security. The more I thought about it, the less certain I became about my own actions that night. I remembered packing up my desk, shutting down my computer, gathering my things, but the specific sequence of events felt hazy, like trying to recall a dream after waking. Details that should have been clear were instead wrapped in uncertainty. I began to wonder if I'd seen her that evening after all, not in the lobby or parking structure, but here in the office. A brief encounter, perhaps, the kind of casual interaction that wouldn't have seemed worth remembering at the time. But now, with her gone and questions multiplying, every forgotten moment felt potentially significant. The initial in her appointment book haunted me. I went through our employee directory, matching names to letters, trying to find a connection that made sense. But there were too many possibilities, and without additional context, the single character could have referred to anyone, or perhaps it wasn't a name at all, but an abbreviation for something else entirely. I found myself staying later and later, long past the time when the cleaning crews finished their rounds. The building took on a different character in the deep hours of the night, sounds carrying differently, shadows falling at unfamiliar angles. I told myself I was being thorough, completing a task that required careful attention to detail. But honestly, I was searching for something I couldn't quite name. The wooden table became a focal point for my growing unease. I'd run my fingers over that rough patch dozens of times now, feeling the disrupted varnish, trying to decode its message. The pattern was becoming more familiar, but its meaning remained elusive, like a word in a foreign language that I almost understood but couldn't quite translate. Sometimes I thought I could hear voices again, just as the security guard had described. Faint conversations drifting from somewhere in the building, too distant to make out words but clear enough to recognize the cadence of human speech. I'd investigate, walking the halls and checking other offices, but I never found a source for the sounds. The realization came gradually, like dawn breaking over a landscape I thought I knew but was seeing clearly for the first time. I wasn't investigating her death anymore. I was investigating my own involvement in it, parsing memories that might not be reliable, questioning a timeline that might not be accurate, trying to understand what role I might have played in events I could no longer clearly recall. The rough patch on the table felt familiar under my fingertips because I'd created it. The water stain marked where I'd placed my own glass that evening, not her coffee cup but something else entirely. The scattered papers, the displaced chair, the computer left logged in with a sentence trailing off into digital silence. These weren't signs of her final moments, but evidence of mine. But evidence of what exactly? That's where my certainty dissolves into something more troubling than ignorance. I know I was here that evening. I know we talked. I know something happened that changed everything. But the specific details remain just out of reach, like trying to grasp water with bare hands. The appointment book lies open on the desk before me, that single initial staring up from the page. I realize now that it might not represent someone else at all. It might be my own initial, written in her careful handwriting, marking a meeting that took place exactly as scheduled but ended in ways neither of us had anticipated. The building settles around me as I sit here in the growing darkness, the curtains moving gently in air that carries the weight of unanswered questions. I understand now why nothing feels quite as it seemed. The truth isn't hidden in the evidence I've been collecting. It's hidden in the spaces between my memories, in the moments I can't quite recall, in the certainty that once felt so solid but now crumbles at the slightest touch.